I love ISPI, and I always want, you guys don't have to be told this. I was a member in 1985, though, so I'm an old guy. And this is what Sue has already told you about the conferences coming up, the special offer for an incredibly cheap deal. And if you want to go to the registration thing, whether you're watching this live or the recorded version, you can point your phone at that QR code and it'll get you there. And also, this is an article which I think Sue is going to put in the chat box. And I'm finding, Sue, can I see both my slides and this chat box at the same time? Is there a way I can do that or not? It doesn't matter, but
I think when you go to slideshow mode, then you can't see the chat.
okay.
So
Fair enough.
I can monitor that for you, though.
Yeah, no big deal. But thank you, I appreciate it. Anyway, there's an article that I published in, of all places, TD, or Talent Development magazine last summer, and here's a link to it. And it really covers in sort of text form a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. What we're really trying to do, coming from, just to step back for a moment, coming from accomplishment-based talent, performance improvement, a la Gilbert and Harless, et cetera, is trying to get out to the larger training and development world that accomplishment-based things are a heck of a lot more measurable and concrete and effective than competency-based ones, among other things. But anyway, if you want to copy the article, I think Sue has put it in the chat box, but also you can get it with this QR code. So here's kind of the agenda for today. A lot of it is really setting the context. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean about being accomplishment-based, and then show you how we look at individual performance or job roles using a tool that we've evolved over the years called the Individual Performance Map, and how we can use that framework, those accomplishments, for defining how we hire people, how we onboard people, how we engage people. And then this notion of agile talent development, which I originally encountered that phrase in a Harvard Business Review article from some years ago. And the notion is that you can use coaching by managers as a way to enable individuals in organizations to develop as needed by changes in the business, by changes in their career paths, and so forth. And so this notion of agile talent development is pretty compelling, and we can, this will plug right into that as well. So even executive coaching, which I'll talk about a little bit. So hopefully we'll have time at the end for some discussion, but that's kind of the overview of what we're going to try to do. So I always like to start with this, even among my ISPI colleagues, because what I've noticed over the years is, even though, Tom Gilbert's work is still, his book, Human Competence, is still taught in graduate schools, for example, and Tom was kind of, obviously, they have an award named after him in ISPI. What I find is that people have different points of view about what it actually means to talk about accomplishments. So I like to tell you how we think about it. And of course, these two guys were formative in my development. I got to meet Tom when I was president of the Boston chapter of ISPI in about 1982 or 3. And we invited him and his wife, Marilyn, up to Boston. And that was my first contact with him. And he became sort of a mentor. He was a bit of a curmudgeon or whatever. He wasn't an easy person, but he was brilliant. But probably more important was his most important protege, who was very big, important leader and thought leader in ISPI, Joe Harless, who had his sort of magnum opus, his most important piece of work in a way, was ABCD, accomplishment-based curriculum development, which he implemented in places like Boeing and the Coast Guard and so forth. These guys were big influencers on me personally and professionally. This really goes back to what Tom said in Human Competence. There's a phrase that sort of a paragraph or a couple sentences I've been citing for 30 years now or so, where Tom said in this book, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he did not mean, just behaviorists or training people. He basically meant everybody. He meant leaders, HR people, that whether or not we're very precise in talking about behavior, we tend to look at our own and other people's, behavior. We set behavioral objectives, a la Mager, et cetera. But his point was that behavior is costly. And if we're going to really do performance improvement or performance engineering, he called it, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, a few years ago, and I actually published an article that you can find on our website, but it's also in the old ISPI Performance Improvement magazine, called something like "What Does It Mean to Be Accomplishment Based?" And what I learned when I looked out at not only within the ISPI community and the publications, but also in the organizational behavior management world and elsewhere, when people use the word accomplishments, they use that word in different ways, it turns out. And sometimes they even mean what we would call business results, and sometimes they mean sort of widgets. And so I coined the phrase probably 30 years ago, work outputs, because I don't want to argue with people about what accomplishments means, but we think the phrase work outputs makes it pretty clear that these are the products of individuals or teams or processes in organizations that are valuable. So I'll be using the words accomplishments and work outputs interchangeably as we go forward. Now, the way we tend to think of what performance is, and as Sue said, I started out as a student with B.F. Skinner, and so I think if I learned something from Skinner, it was precision in how you define the elements of whatever you're looking at. And what we've said for years is that basically, based on certainly on Gilbert's way of thinking, there's really three elements. There's behavior, there's the products of behavior, work outputs, and there's what we would say organizational or business results. Now, it's always easy to think about this in kind of a sports or athletic context. And so especially if you're not in the US and you talk about football, people think you mean soccer. So I have clients all over the world. So we use this soccer girl. And if this were animated, it would be kind of obvious. She's doing something. She's behaving. She's kicking the ball. Now, what is the expected work output or accomplishment? Well, it's a goal. It's a ball in the net. Or it might be a ball to somebody on her team who heads it into the net. But ultimately, it's about the goal, because the goal is what gives you a score. And if your team, the organizational result is winning the game. And so this is a kind of it's not even really a metaphor. It's a real example of behavior, performance. Now, what we say, and we're sort of nitpicky about it, but I think I got that from Joe Harless, is that behavior is an action, and you have to start out with a verb. That's how we describe behavior. Work outputs, on the other hand, are things. They're not just the completion of behavior. They're not just like procedure completed. We want to know what the procedure produced. And so what we've always said is accountable now. It's actually a thing, and we'll talk more about that shortly. And then we talk about organizational or business results. And I used to just talk about business results because I work mostly with sort of global corporations and such. But there's an awful lot of organizations that we work with more and more, not-for-profits. And some people, running those organizations even get creeped out if they're, anti-capitalist or whatever. So we use the word organizational results is sort of as a synonym for business results. But the point is, we try to focus people on the overall result for the organization. What are the results that reflect the success of the organization in pursuing its mission? So this is the simple way we think about it. And but also, as you'll see, in addition to Gilbert, Harless, and others, Steve Jobs is a big influence on the work that we do here, and it'll probably become fairly obvious because simplicity was what he brought to the table in all of the way Apple moved forward. And so I don't want to diss the HPT model because I've had it on my own slide sets for decades. And this is a version of what Sue showed us. But what I've started to find as early as the 80s was when I shared this with my clients and stakeholders, or even I had, for example, I remember one woman who was head of training at a medical company, and she had this on her wall. She had a big old poster of the HPT model, and she used to say, we're trying to do this, but there's a lot of stuff that comes up, and our stakeholders say, oh, I don't know, it's kind of complicated. And if executives walk by, they might say, how long is this going to take? Is this analysis paralysis? And so the model is beautiful because it kind of includes most everything you'd want to know. But what we recognized was that if, at least that was my point of view, that if you really wanted to partner with your stakeholders, if you didn't just want to be a performance professional who kind of parachutes in and does some program or delivers on the, the order taking request, but you really wanted to engage with your stakeholders, managers, leaders, and so forth, you need to do something else. You need to make it simpler. So we made it simpler, and I don't think simplistic. And it's really what we've come to call performance thinking, because our clients told us probably 20 years ago, you're teaching us a different way to think. But this is the way we think about it. We say, um, you know, things, so-called behavior influences, either positively or negatively affect behavior, which ideally produces accomplishments or work outputs. And if they're valuable, they contribute to organizational results. And this is how it works. It works from left to right. And we analyze it with the end in mind. And if you look at the examples under there, you'll see, business results. Those are examples from different kinds of organizations of things that an organization would look at as reflecting the success of the whole business in this case, like revenue, profit, customer satisfaction, market share. Those aren't just some departmental result or process result. Those are something that the executives, the stakeholders, the investors would be looking at and say, how are they doing on this stuff? And so we always want to make clear that ultimately work outputs or accomplishments are valuable to the extent that they contribute to those things.
Oh, no.
And then we'll show you this list again, but the words under work outputs here, accomplishments, is not a taxonomy, because it's just a set of words that we've identified over the decades.
Really getting
I think there might be somebody with their mic that needs to get muted, because there's a bunch of sound in the background. But anyway, what we would say is that these words, deliverables, transactions, and so forth, are words that we've found that when we're interviewing and observing performers or trying to understand what accomplishments are, these are all useful words to prompt that discussion. And I'll dig into that a little bit more in a few minutes. And then, under behavior, those are just a bunch of verbs. And obviously you would describe what they were planning or analyzing in more detail, but the emphasis is those are kinds of actions. And then behavior influences are the things that have an impact on behavior. So this is our simple model of performance. And we're focusing on work outputs or accomplishments. Having been in the lineage of Gilbert and Harless, we really emphasize the fact that until you understand what the accomplishments are in a given situation, you don't really have the valuable part of the thing. You really need to anchor it all to that. And we'll come back to that as well. So I mentioned these different words. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not a taxonomy. These are not mutually exclusive categories, but they're phrases that you can have a conversation with people. People understand what deliverables are. They're usually concrete things like documents or widgets or whatever that you can actually feel, see, touch, etc. But things like transactions are also accomplishments, like a loan or a sale. And so are decisions. People often don't think about it that way, but if you reflect on this for a moment, you go through a lot of decision-making behavior. But once you get to the end, you decide what car you're going to buy. You decide whether to hire a person or not. You decide whether you've satisfied the customer or not. You make decisions, which are often highly valuable products of behavior. Milestones are just a word that we use when we're talking about processes. They're just the sub-outputs along the way in a process. Each step produces something that gets passed on to the next step. And progress indicators is a phrase that we started using with sales performance analysis probably 25 years ago, because of course in the sales world, you're usually trying to accomplish, an appointment with the CFO, a request for proposal, an opportunity to demo your product or whatever. And those are often thought by salespeople as being things that you actually set as goals often for your sales calls that move you toward the final deal. Relationships is one of my favorite because we used to have, for 11 years, we did a summer institute event where we would have like 50 of our colleagues from around the world come together, and it was a wonderful event. We haven't done it for a few years for a whole bunch of reasons, but we first piloted a session there years ago on relationships as valuable accomplishments. And if you reflect on it for a moment, whether in your personal life or in your professional work life, good relationships that are good working relationships with your clients, with your boss, with your peers, with other companies, with your friends, those are actually things that you work to establish and maintain. And you can even define what a good one is. And so we actually did a webinar on that you could find on our YouTube channel a couple years ago. That's kind of fun. Changes or innovations are the kinds of outputs you see in a creative, innovative, R&D environment. Things like prototype products or new ideas or improved processes. Products of communication is an odd phrase, I know, but when I work with people and we certify them in this approach, they often say, well, meetings and presentations and phone calls are accomplishments. And I say, no, they're not. They're just behavior. Now, if the phone call leads to an appointment, the appointment is the output. If the presentation leads to people clapping or folks coming up to the front of the room and giving you their business cards or asking you questions, those are products of the activity of presenting something. But very often people confuse things like meetings, presentations, phone calls, and so forth, which are really behavior, as accomplishments. So we've tried to use this phrase, products of communication, so people will look at that. One of the fun things I've used over the years, I have a colleague who has a large behavioral health organization, and he's also an organizational behavior management guy. And a few years ago, I was working with him, and he said, tell me again, like, what's this? Why do you care so much about accomplishments? And I just said, have you ever been in a meeting that didn't produce anything of value? And it's like it was a head bumper. It's like, oh my God, of course. We met for an hour, no decisions, action steps, agreements, plans, nothing came out of it. It was just activity for an hour. And so that's kind of the idea here. Solutions or answers, obviously, for tech support or customer service people, that's often an important output. People who is a kind of a funny one, but I learned that years ago when I was working a lot in customer service. And I remember asking a real star, exemplary performer, it was at AT&T Wireless, actually, I remember her. And I started to ask her, like, what are some of your most important outputs? And she said, or accomplishments, I might have used the word, I don't remember, but she said, customer satisfaction. And I thought for a minute, and I realized that wasn't true, because customer satisfaction is an aggregate business measure, and it's very important. But for her as a customer service representative, a person who says you solved my problem, or rates her as 5 on a scale of 5, or is smiling by the end of the conversation. In other words, people who fill in the blank is what her real output was, one call at a time. And similarly, as a trainer, for example, a person who can do the thing that you're supposed to be teaching them how to do, or as a manager, a person who now can accomplish some new thing or successfully completes a project. So people who are often the products of those of us who influence other people. And the same with teams. So these are just examples of the words that we've used. But what we find is if we use them as prompts, we sometimes people will say, oh yeah, they hadn't thought of decisions, etc. Now, the way we apply this is, first of all, we take our 6 boxes model, which some of you probably know is a plain English version of Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model that I sort of developed in the late 80s, and it got named by a client, the 6 boxes, client down at Bradstreet named Tom Hogan in 91, because I always said, well, this is derived from Gilbert's behavior engineering model, but obviously it's different, and I would always kind of hem and haw about it because I wanted to give Tom credit. And Tom Hogan was a very wily VP of sales training sitting in the back of the room this one time, and he said, well, you're always talking about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? So that's what we did. But anyway, it's the way that we make sense of behavior influences. It's the framework that encompasses and ought to define all the things we can do to influence behavior or the things that may get in the way. So if you paste these two very simple models together, what we call performance improvement logic is a flexible sort of prerequisite sequence thing where we start out, whatever the conversation is, whether it's a formal project or an informal coaching session with some direct report, we want to know what's at stake. Why are we having this conversation? Is this because of customer satisfaction or revenue or market share or safety or what is it? And sometimes it's a bunch of different business results, but let's just at least check in and be sure we know why we're doing stuff. And then once we know that, then if we look at that individual or that team or that training program, that's when we look for the accomplishments or the work outputs. And we want to be sure, Michael mentioned the lean thing, we want to be sure that those work outputs have value. And the way we think about that is if they credibly contribute to one or more business results, we keep them in. But if there's some, let's say, form or some step that produces something that actually doesn't deliver value, then we often get rid of it. In any case, this is the core of it. We say, okay, what are the work outputs or the accomplishments here? That anchors our analysis. And then we can observe people. We can do task analysis. We can do exemplary behavior analysis. But one way or the other, we can discover or define the behavior needed to produce those work outputs. But until we have the work outputs, behavior for its own sake is like, who knows what it is, which stuff to pick. But once we know what the work output is, it's a heck of a lot easier to define the needed behavior. Once we've defined these three elements in any given project, we're in a much stronger position to select measures because we can measure behavior. We can checklist it. We can count how many times people do stuff, but it does require us to observe to do a real job of that. And it's a little bit challenging. It's one of the reasons people go to competencies, because competencies are abstractions that you can use subjective ratings for and think you're doing something. But to measure behavior is not easy, and it's takes some time and money and so forth usually. Business results are very important, and most of our organizations are, in some level, looking at those, but they tend to be lagging indicators, and we can't make very many decisions because in most cases, we might not get that data, if we're lucky, monthly, maybe quarterly. But work outputs that people produce or processes or teams produce day by day, hour by hour, week by week, those we can count. The tangible ones we can count a lot more easily, but we can do stuff like count good decisions, good hiring decisions, and things like that. So our point is that once you define the elements of the performance you're looking at, it's a heck of a lot easier to figure out what you could possibly measure. And maybe just for now, and then for later, you say, okay, what's the easiest, most straightforward thing to measure? Once we have a pretty good idea about that, then we can say, okay, let's take a look at the behavior influences involved here, if it's existing performance. If it's what Joe Harless would have called new performance planning, we're just sort of speculating and brainstorming about the behavior influences. But if it's an existing performance, which I think is what most of us wind up doing, whether we're training or performance improvement or process or whatever our expertise is, now we're looking at these behavior influences, and we use the 6 boxes framework, and we throw in at this point a little bit of what people would call design thinking. Because what we'll do is we'll take the output, whatever an output is, we'll look at the behavior, and then we'll observe and interview people to figure out in each of those cells where relevant, what are the pluses and minuses? Are expectations clear? How are they delivered? Or are they unclear and conflicting or missing? How about feedback? How's that working for you, et cetera? So you can go through the 6 boxes and you can analyze what's a plus, what's a minus, what's missing. Once you have a pretty good idea of that, then based on talking to exemplary performers, based on best practices, based on stuff we've observed over the whatever, we can brainstorm possible improvements. And we just inserted that into our process maybe 10 years ago, because what we realized was that most of us tend to jump to the usual interventions. Okay, train them. Okay, give them a job aid. Well, maybe, but let's brainstorm. Let's look at all the things we could do, because we might come up with some very simple ideas that would be cost effective. And we like to kind of, so to speak, brainstorm, think out of the box a little bit. I don't really mean that when it comes to the 6 boxes, but you know what I mean. It's like, okay, what are the options here? And then ideally with our stakeholders, we say, let's choose the configuration of behavior influences we're going to put in place we think will optimize ROI and support the behavior needed to produce the work outputs to deliver business results. Then we implement, measure, and we adjust for continuous improvement. And this is sort of part of the agile aspect of it. I don't know what your experience is, but I don't think we ever get it completely right. And in fact, some of our clients, like our largest long-term client, the Amgen biotech company, which is certified over 350 performance thinking practitioners using our methodology, they explicitly built into their project approach what they call S for sustainment. And they always make a deal with their clients up front that once we implement, we're going to come back some weeks later and we're going to do a quick and dirty sort of 6 boxes analysis to see what we missed, so we can adjust and continuously improve. And then the other thing, and this is a big reason that we in the late 80s, early 90s developed these very simple models, and we user tested the plain English language, is that people understand these words pretty well. They don't even think we're talking any kind of a jargon or technical language. And so it becomes much easier with our business clients, with the people that report to them, with our folks in other silos in the organization, to begin to share these models and language, and people get it pretty quickly. So this is how we approach performance broadly. Now, of course, there are work outputs and processes. So here's a very nice colleague of mine, Holly Ahman, did this. And if you zero in on it, you can see how she did it. She did her process map. And then for each process map in the little purple blobs, she has the outputs. This happens to be in a behavioral health applied behavior analysis organization. But you can see it's really sweet. It's quite beautiful as well as being well done. For each step in the process, there's an output that gets passed on usually to the next step. But, we're not usually talking about processes when we're talking about talent development, although sometimes we might be taking a team and developing their ability to execute a process. But even then, if you think about it, there's enough individual differences among people that ideally we're not just doing a sheep dip for everybody, although traditionally that's how training and development has done it. But we're looking at individuals and roles. And so we have a tool that we call the individual performance map, and we've evolved it over quite a few years. I originally got this sort of visual from Jack Zigan years ago, and he was an early kind of protege of Tom Gilbert. And he used this kind of a thing to identify measures, because he was very much into identifying measures for people. But we shifted it. And so what we got here is we've got the performer in the middle, and then we've got the customers, the people or individuals or teams to whom the sales director, in this case, delivers value, the VP of sales, the senior account manager, and the customer service team. And then we've got the outputs or accomplishments. So if you look at those, you see they're all nouns, and some of them are smaller than others, as sales data summary, answers to questions. Some of them are bigger, like improved processes. But these are all things. And here's another example. Here's a human resources director in a small medical devices company that was, I was working with the president of the company and his VPs and directors, and this was his individual performance map. We teach people in our Imagine programs to do this. And you can see it's not an infinite number of things, but when you do a good job in this and you ask the person, is this their whole job? They'll say, yep, you got it, most of it. Here's a clinical supervisor, a board certified behavior analyst in a applied behavior analysis company that serves kids with autism. And this is a big, hairy job. There's a lot of outputs here. And it's a tough job. But you also, one of the reasons I show this is that you can see the blue items there. A lot of times you deliver the same accomplishments or outputs to multiple customers, although sometimes, as you can see by the slightly tweaked language of treatment plan ready for review or treatment plan ready for signature, they might be slightly different. They might be outputs that are further along in the process or prepared for a particular customer. But again, this is the person's whole job. Or here's a regional director in a behavioral health company. Different stuff. Notice things like action plans, supervision notes, staffing report. This is getting into sort of a mid-level management role. And so you get different kinds of stuff in here. Here's a VP of marketing and sales. This happens to be my ex-partner who was in a VC funded company for a while as a small business. But notice some of her outputs were a compelling reason to invest for investors, or a market analysis, or products from us that enable her external customers. So that's another example, very different kinds of outputs. Here's a team leader, things like improvement ideas or new tools given to her peers, or staff meeting notes, or feedbacks. These are all things that a team leader might produce. And so the point is, we can define jobs and individual roles with the accomplishments they contribute. And for many people, that's a new idea. Because one of the reasons I think is that a lot of our colleagues, and historically in performance improvement, people have talked about accomplishments as being really big things. And sometimes they are. But when it comes to the level of an individual or even a team, very often there's sort of smaller chunks that are reflected in the graphics that I just showed you, in the maps I just showed you. And so those can get turned into job profiles. Here's a job profile for a payroll specialist, and really only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 outputs, or 5 outputs listed there: at payroll, responses to requests for information, proactive recommendations, client-facing reports, and client relationship. Now, what you see there, and I haven't mentioned this yet, and we're not going to spend much time on it, but we always want people, once they identify the work outputs, to define what we call criteria for a good one. So if I look at a decision or a recommendation or a relationship or a report, what makes it a good example of that output? Some people would call those standards. There's different words for them, but it's essentially the criteria that define the thing, not how the thing was made, but what the actual product it is, that means it's a good one. And in some ways, that's even tougher than finding the accomplishments of the outputs. Here's a really cool one. You can probably not even read it because it's so small, but I love it because this was a person in a Dubai company, Alpha Time, which is one of these Middle Eastern companies, I think funded by oil money, where the company had something like 70 different businesses. They had the local Nissan dealer. They had the whatever. They were all over the Middle East in their small businesses. They also had manufacturing business. They had all kinds of businesses. But every single business they had what they called a level 2 manager, who would be sort of a store manager if it was a retail operation, might be a team manager in some other setting. But what was interesting to me about it is that this woman was able to come up with this list of work outputs, strategic plans, set of standards, clear expectations down the left, with criteria and measures. And she even put this little modified individual performance map in this thing. And this was actually 1 page in their job description. So some of our clients have gone far into this idea of having accomplishment-based job profiles. And, one of the things I want to mention, and any of you who've ever followed my work know that I think competencies are the worst thing that ever happened to performance improvement or human resources, because they make us think we're doing something useful, but actually they muddy the water. They are these abstractions that people rate. And we could argue about that, and I've got blogs that are rather, poking your eye about that I put out over the years. But I've had so many conversations with people who've said stuff like, oh, yeah, we got to go through our performance review. And I sure hope the boss didn't have a fight with his wife this morning, because maybe I'll get a 4 instead of a 3 like I did last time. Or I've talked to, I have a colleague who's the senior vice president of sales. And he says, oh, yeah, HR tells me I can't give too many 5s because I got to give people room for advancement. Like, what does that mean? That is not measurement. That is refined opinion. So the cool thing about accomplishments is you can count them. You can count the good ones and the not so good ones. So you don't have to make, subjective ratings about them. You can say if the criteria are clear, you can define whether they're good ones or not, and you can actually count them. And so that's in contrast to rating people. So I don't want to get off in the competencies discussion too much, but part of the reason that we're trying to push this notion of accomplishment-based talent development is because we think it's a much more sure-footed approach and frankly, easier in many ways than competency-based stuff. So if you define accomplishments, first of all, uh, if you now start thinking about talent development, where does talent development start? Well, it typically starts with hiring. And one of the nice things is if we have a job and we know what its outputs or accomplishments are, we can have some pretty good behavior-based questions. We can say, well, have you ever built a strategic plan for your team? Or how about a tough relationship that you've tried to improve? Tell me about that. Or how about when you make hiring decisions? In other words, you can have behavioral interview questions built around the things that this job needs to produce. You can also have some performance-based assessments for hiring and onboarding. You can, for example, one of the areas that more and more people are coming to us, the field of applied behavior analysis in the autism world has become kind of an industry to the extent that there are now private equity firms investing in them and so forth. So some of these companies are coming to us and they, for example, hire people to be clinical supervisors who have to produce treatment plans or session notes after a clinical session. Well, during the hiring process, if somebody comes in saying they're an experienced clinical supervisor, you can give them a treatment plan, say, here, what do you think? Fix it. Or are there improvements you'd make? In other words, you can have some assessments based on the kind of work that people actually will have to produce, and you can see how people do. So even in the hiring process, accomplishments are useful. And then if you think of onboarding as more than a meeting where you fill out your forms, find out how to get your computer and where the bathroom is, if you think of onboarding as a process that gets people up to speed over a period of weeks or months, then you can take those outputs and you can say, well, what do we need to hire people able to produce first day? What do we need to get people up to speed with on the first week, or maybe after initial training, or in the first month? What are the outputs that they only have to do once or twice a year so we can wait on those? So you can actually build a timeline for onboarding based on accomplishments. The other thing, and I'm going to mention this a little bit more, but one of the beauties about accomplishments is because they're valuable and you can usually point to the business results to which they contribute credibly, you can help people see how they make a difference, even if they're buried way down in the organization. So those are some of the advantages of being accomplishment-based. And I mentioned this thing about, engaging people in understanding their contributions. You can, blather at people all day about how if they ask more open-ended questions or do things in a certain way, it will make a difference. But if you show them the work outputs that they have to produce, even something, I've been in companies where, for example, you had people who were sitting in front of a computer for a good portion of the day, and they had to fill out little forms like session notes or call notes, or maybe little other kinds of small forms that they would fill out. And it would be kind of boring, and they go, oh, geez, another one of these. But if you could say to them, look, if this session note is a good one, it can have an impact on regulatory compliance. And, if these are not complete, if they don't meet the criteria we've specified for a good one, we could be in trouble if they give us an audit. So you can sort of open people's eyes, and then you can do it in the positive way too. You can say, if this, process improvement plan is good, it may affect our bottom line. It may affect our profitability. So you can kind of do that, and it's much easier with work outputs or accomplishments, and people like that. And then the other thing to think about, and I always go back to my personal life in this one, because I don't know about you, but if I'm having a down day, or I'm sort of not very energetic, or I'm tired, or I'm bored, I'm in my office, or maybe I'm even in my house, and it's like, oh, geez, if I start doing stuff like producing some simple outputs like a clean desk or get the bills all paid, and so I got up to date on bills, boat in the water if I'm a sailor. Those are kinds of things where you feel good about it. You say, oh man, that's, it'll raise your mood. And on the job, the same thing is true. If you have defined outputs or accomplishments in your work and you produce good ones, it usually feels pretty good to most people. I know I love to write, and when I write a proposal or a blog post or sometimes an article, I have to confess, I like to reread it when it's done because I like it. I like my accomplishments. So there's a whole thing about that, which I think is important to point out. And if you want to know more about it, we did a blog on employee engagement, workforce retention, a couple of, or not a blog, a YouTube webinar a few years ago. And so you can point at that QR code and get to it. It's on our YouTube channel, which is performancethinking.tv. So I've said all that stuff and spent a lot of my time here doing that. But let me put this together in the way we think about talent development, because hopefully I've identified things which will make sense now that we're looking at the elements. So the first thing is, if you say talent development starts with recruitment and hiring, you can do what I mentioned a few minutes ago. We can, first of all, define the jobs with accomplishments, and then create performance tests or behavioral interview questions to really, focus our recruitment and hiring process. And then, as I already mentioned also, we can bring people up to speed through initial training, through coaching, through having, through shadowing somebody who knows how to do it. There's a variety of ways we can do it, but we can make, instead of just behavioral criterion referenced approach, we can have an accomplishment criterion referenced approach where we say, yep, you're pretty good at producing those, those design documents now, or those findings and recommendations reports, or subsections of them. We can explicitly focus on outputs and be sure people are able to produce them through both training and non-training interventions. And then if it goes beyond job readiness, you may, those of you who know about the 6 boxes, recognize in that text, when you're actually getting ready, people ready to really be ready for some new part of their job, or maybe they're just coming on board, you can use the 6 boxes, not just skills and knowledge, but clear expectations from management, feedback, more frequent in the beginning, being sure that they have good tools and resources, which might include job aids or checklists, or performance support things, or learning in the flow little modules, but tools that enable people while they're doing their job to learn and do it properly. You can arrange informal consequences and incentives. You can thank people. You can have point systems. You can show them their progress through becoming masterful at their various outputs, etc. So you can arrange formally or informally, or be sure that supervisors and managers say, that's nice, I like the way you're doing, you're getting really good at this now. And of course you can do skills and knowledge. You can train people, but as you all probably know very well, that's not the only way to get skills and knowledge. If you give people a good job aid, set expectations for them to use it, and give them frequent feedback, you may be able to get new skills and knowledge without taking them off the job for training, and so forth. So the point is, we can then develop people in that way. And then what we think is that if you have a coaching process, which is accomplishment based, and it's not just sort of open-ended kind of what I sometimes think of the non-directive therapy version of coaching, where I ask you a whole lot of questions so you can figure out what your problem is, and then I ask you a whole bunch of more questions so you can figure out what your solution is. And that's great for many things. But if we're talking about job performance, it makes a lot more sense to say, here's all the outputs expected in your job, and we've added a couple new ones lately because your job changed a little bit. But what should we focus on this week? Which output should we talk about if you're coaching somebody? And you say, okay, how much do you need to know about how you do it? Can you already do it, or do we need to get into that? Do we just need to be sure you're being supported so you're getting the right resources and so forth? So you can engage people in an ongoing coaching cadence that is accomplishment based, that continuously develops them. And it's almost 10 years ago now, there was an article in Harvard Business Review, and you can get to it through that QR code, called HR Goes Agile. And the premise of the article was quite interesting. It basically said, companies and businesses are moving so fast these days that through traditional development plans, or even just your LMS, are not sufficient. You can't do a sort of a sheep dip for everybody. What you need to do is you need to be able to work with individuals and develop their capabilities as needed. So if you're in a team and you got a new project coming up and you don't have anybody on the project who knows how to do the requirements analysis document the way we do it around here, you need somebody to get up to speed on that. Or if you have somebody who's doing great, but their proposals are not so good, you can help them improve them, or their relationships need help, or whatever it is. So you can, and the notion of agile is, if you're an accomplishment-based coach and you have a relationship with your direct reports, which is ongoing about their outputs or their accomplishments, you can develop them as needed, and you can be sort of the quarterback or the coordinator. You might say, oh, well, you should go do that module in the LMS. Or you might say, look, Jack is really good at this. Go shadow him for a couple hours and you'll see how he does it. But the point is, if you have that relationship with your direct reports, you can actually coach people ongoing in a way that's agile and that responds to the changes in business requirements. And so we have actually a coaching methodology called the performance thinking coach. And this slide is meant to represent that. It starts with the coach sitting down with the individual and actually creating their individual performance map. They don't just pull it out of the file and show it to them, because what we find is the conversation with the person you're coaching, where you both agree these are your customers, these are your outputs, is a really productive way to set clear expectations from the beginning and get both the manager and their direct report or whoever's being coached on the same page. And then you can basically apply the logic that we teach there at an individual level to help them become real good at whatever the output is or improve it. And so again, if you want to know more about that, we got a webinar we did on that a few years ago too. It was mostly Shane Isley has worked a lot in the applied behavior analysis world, so I think a lot of the examples are in there, but it's a generally applicable thing. So, and even past that, if you think about talent development and management is also including promotion and transfer into a department for a higher job, or what some of my clients have called exporting talent, where you've got a team and you're managing this team and your best person.
Have a good weekend, Troy. See you Monday.
You really don't want to get rid of them, but you export talent so they become manager of another team. Or you can also do a compensation review. It can be built around how people are doing with respect to their accomplishments. And we even discovered something. We discovered an executive coaching methodology, which is extremely cool, at least from my perspective. Executive coaches typically have quite a few tricks in their kit, and there's a lot of things that they can do that are helpful. They can be a rent-a-friend in the sense that it's tough being a senior executive. It's good to have somebody to talk to in confidence, to bounce ideas off. If your coach is pretty knowledgeable and has a lot of business acumen, that can be super helpful. Or I've had a couple colleagues who were executive coaches whose job mostly was to fix executives who were misbehaving in meetings or being inappropriate somehow, but they were really good at what they did. And so the company invested in a coach to help settle them down. But one of the things you can do is this, and I've done it quite a bit. We were going to actually do a certification thing a few years ago, and then COVID hit. So we haven't gotten back to that. But the notion is, if you sit down with a senior leader, in this case, it was a chief learning officer that was brought into the company for to basically push so-called digital transformation. So as you look at some of the outputs, you'll see that that's a factor in a bunch of the outputs. But if you have a conversation with a leader and you create an individual performance map, first of all, it will kind of blow their minds, because they have usually senior leaders, as you well know, executives have pretty complicated jobs. And a lot, they're in meetings all the time and such. But if you start noticing that there's decisions or vision statements or hiring criteria or plans or goals, you start to say, oh, they got a bunch of outputs here. And you can actually define their whole job on an individual performance map. And usually you say at the end of the conversation, you say, well, you think we got it all? And they say, oh my God, you're right, I did. Once you have that, then you're in this really interesting position to help the executive understand how to optimize their contributions. Because you can do things like say, okay, well, which of these do you think are the most important, like the highest leverage? And they might circle some of them or mark them. And then you say, well, which ones do consume most of your time? A lot of times they're not the same things. And then you can have questions like, well, is there anybody you can delegate some of these things to? You can also ask things like, do you have a succession plan? And then you can go beyond them and you can say, okay, notice that you're giving some outputs like to your team members, a vision statement, a criterion, work, feedbacks, resources, et cetera. You can say, well, how are your team members, the people that report to you, responding to this? Can we help to optimize their performance? Maybe even go do a performance map for them and try to optimize that. Or what are the processes to which you're contributing? Because senior leaders are often contributing things like goals, decisions, criteria, plans to processes. And, you can say, well, how are those processes going? Should we take a look at those more carefully? Maybe we can optimize them. If you're frustrated because you're sending a lot of stuff into the meetings about processes and it ain't happening. So you can essentially unpack the senior executive's contributions in the organization and help her or him optimize their impact. And we've hardly stretched this muscle. I've done it with a bunch of people, and some of my colleagues have, but it's a thing we're hoping to really turn into a real sort of micro certification thing, in most cases for existing executive coaches, but also for performance improvement professionals who want to develop closer, more trusted relationships with their executives. So in the end, if we're looking at this from a talent development point of view, it's a lot easier to measure this stuff because, for example, an individual contributor can monitor themselves, their managers and their teams, or even from a whole department or organization. You can actually count new or improved accomplishments once you get people focused on those and you know what the criteria are. So you can actually objectively measure how much have we developed our people and in what ways over the last X amount of time. You can also, of course, because you can define productivity a little bit more explicitly with outputs, like, for example, solutions per hour for customer service reps or first-time resolutions for customer service reps. Those are outputs. And, for example, we published something about this a few years ago. We were able to take the ramp up of new AT&T wireless customer service reps from first day to benchmark productivity in 2 weeks. And prior to our intervention, it used to take them 2 months. So you can actually look at time to performance in a very objective way if you have outputs. And then, of course, overall, you can look at things like counting promotions, raises and compensation, et cetera, related to accomplishments. How much are we developing our people and expanding their capabilities? So here's some summary takeaways, and then I want to hopefully have some Q&A kind of conversations. We can definitely create and revise individual and role-based job descriptions based on accomplishments. I hope that the examples I showed you made that clear. They can also serve in very useful ways at every stage in talent development, and I hope that that little process that I showed you also made that pretty clear. They will enable you to do agile talent development with coaching. In other words, focus on the accomplishments that this individual needs to improve or add or develop, and help them do it through both training and non-training interventions. And as a coach or manager, be their kind of coordinator of development. The other thing is that, leaders, managers, and supervisors are in a much stronger position to set expectations and provide feedback if it's accomplishment based. I have a blog I did a few years ago. It's on our website. It was in response to a Business Review article about the problems with feedback. And probably everybody in this group has experienced that people talk about feedback, but you can have effective feedback or not so effective feedback. And part of that is it's kind of hard sometimes to give feedback about behavior. And it's impossible to give feedback about competencies because they can mean different things in different contexts. But with outputs where we have criteria, we can set expectations. We can say this widget needs to, have all the screws tightened up to spec. It needs that there can't be any fuzzy edges on it. It has to be ready to insert into the assembly. You can define the accomplishments, and then you can look at the thing and you can say, well, that's great, or you kind of missed it on that one. Let's refine that. So people who are in charge of helping other people to perform, they ought to know what their people need to accomplish so they can provide better expectations and feedback. As I mentioned earlier, accomplishments give us a way to connect everybody more clearly to the organization's success or business results. We can count them. That's pretty fundamental as a form of measurement. And so these are all some of the sort of summary points I'd like you to think about. And that TD magazine article is not a bad summary of this stuff. So a couple more things, and then I just want to open it up for Q&A. This is sort of, I don't know if anybody here used to listen to Car Talk, but I lived in Boston for 26 years, and there were Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, and they had this weekly radio show about fixing cars. And they used to talk about this shameless commerce moment. So this is a little shameless commerce. This is our YouTube channel. It's free. You don't have to pay for it or anything like that. Easy way to remember it, it's at performancethinking.tv. Next month will be our 50th webinar that we've recorded. We've also got some short playlists on coaching, performance improvement, and so forth. So that's a good resource. And this is the shameless commerce part. We bring our performance thinking practitioner program, which is a certification based on project completion, or at least analysis, design, and sort of findings and recommendations document. We bring that into big companies, and we sometimes certify people in big companies if they've got a lot of people who want to become performance professionals and expand from training and development. But we also do an open program 4 times a year that I teach, and the next one starts on the 16th of June. And so if you look at our website, performancethinking.com or sixboxes.com, there's a little thing to click there. And if anybody's interested or know anybody that is, I always like to talk to people to be sure it's a good fit. But anyway, that's that. And we also do have our coaching program, although it is in the process of being revised to become completely virtual. So that's our little super guide, but I just wonder if we've got some questions and such. And I think I need to out of this, maybe, and then maybe minimize it and come back to you all. So I hope that was okay, and I hope we've got enough time for some Q&A discussion. So what do you think? Sue, you look frozen on your screen. Oh, no, you moved. Okay.
Great job, Dr. Binder. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you have any, feel free to come off mute or, it looks like Nancy Allen has a question.
Yes, thank you. This was really fascinating, and we've gone through a few rounds of competency identification, and I could just feel the pain of it as you were describing this performance. So yeah. I have a lot of questions. I just have to remember at least a couple of them. How do you begin the transition, first of all? Yeah. Let's start with that. And I have a couple of more questions.
Well, I think it's like any change management thing, where you got to get some champions and change agents. Mm-hmm. So what I think is the easiest way to slip this into an organization, the reason we have a program for performance professionals and for coaches is because we think in theory that covers the earth. That is, if we get training and development folks to expand their scope to being performance improvement specialists, so they're not just looking at skills and knowledge, but they're partnering with their stakeholders to arrange other conditions to optimize ROI, et cetera, that if they're accomplishment based, even if they don't make too big of a deal in the beginning, it's like setting learning objectives where you say, instead of saying at the end of this module, you'll be able to do or know X, you say at the end of this module, you'll be able to produce X. A treatment plan, a requirements document, a widget that fits the thing. People almost don't notice that. So that's kind of a sneaky way of starting to get it in through the learning and performance folks. And if you teach coaches to do what I was describing, that can be a separate program. And as you, I'm sure, well know, a lot of companies are really into coaching these days, but they tend to be behavior based. So if you say, well, we got another way, we're going to focus on the value people deliver, that's also a way to kind of sneak it in. Because what I think is because of the simple models we have, at an initial level, we may not have a formal implementation of accomplishment-based talent development. But if we can begin to move our training and development people toward being accomplishment-based performance improvement folks, and if we can begin to get our leaders and managers coaching their people based on accomplishments, and some of them become enthusiastic about it. Because I will tell you, when I've had conversations with business people, usually when I was doing a lot of consulting projects, and I really don't anymore, I just teach people how to do this and then I coach them through projects. But when I was doing a lot of, especially before COVID, I would go into some senior leader's office and they'd be the decision maker and I'd be having a conversation with them. And then I'd say something like, can I use your whiteboard for a second? I think I can help you understand a little more about how we think. And I draw out the performance chains, starting with the business results, and talk a little bit about it with examples they told me about, and then the 6 boxes. And none of them would say, well, that looks like a bunch of jargon to me. They'd all say, oh, makes sense to me. And so what I've learned is that business people also have the notion, when they see we're talking about the valuable products of people's behavior, it makes sense to them. So this doesn't really answer your question altogether. But I think the way you get started is by introducing this way of thinking through leadership and management, and or through performance improvement in your training and development organization, and move. Now, the companies that I know that have been somewhat successful at this, it's taken them maybe 18 months plus or minus to start from where you have a few people who were your internal clients, and they said, wow, that really made a difference. That was cool. To where they say, okay, this is where we're going to do everything. But I think those are the ways in, if that makes any sense. Is that useful answer?
Yes, it is. I'll just keep it down to one more question then. So this really focuses on the what?
Yes, that's
this is the accomplishment. You can accomplish, but what about the how?
Well, the cool part is, once you know what the what is, it's a heck of a lot easier to figure out the how. Because, when Tom Gilbert, for example, one of the other big ideas that I pulled from his work is this notion of exemplary behavior analysis. So once you talk about a requirements document or a widget or a process design or whatever the output is, then you can observe and interview the people who are real good at it. And you can do task analysis if you want to, but my experience is you can actually capture from people what they do step by step, or maybe isn't always a sequence, to produce the thing. And so to me, the outputs direct us to the behavior. They make it a heck of a lot easier. Instead of just making stuff up or imagining what might be helpful, we can actually figure out, like in sales performance, for example. I've done a lot of sales enablement, and we'll find successful salespeople, and we'll say, what are the broad stages of your process? Maybe strategizing and planning, in front of customers, follow-up, paperwork, whatever. And then we say, well, what's the first thing you're trying to get to or accomplish? And they'll tell us stuff like, an appointment, or, a relationship with the CFO, or whatever it is. And then you start probing. You start, well, how do you do that? And you talk to some of the more successful people, and you capture the behavior. And so the how actually comes out of how people produce it, rather than some abstraction, if that makes sense.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Did you have any other questions, Nancy?
That's a good one.
That was, let's see. Oh, the coaching. So that feels labor intensive, because people are all trying to do, so this, you put that coaching responsibility onto managers. And so it's just like, okay, you as the manager needs to be coaching. And what kind of response do you get with people like, we don't have time for this? Just give them more training, because I don't have time to coach them on this process that they need to do.
Well, let me put that in context, which is that I have this standard routine that I've been saying to leaders and managers for years, which is that the job of a leader or manager is not necessarily to be the smartest person on the team. The job of a leader or manager is to arrange conditions so the people that they lead and manage will be productive and engaged. Bottom line, that's it. Now, if we can give them a mechanism for that, that will be great. And so, first of all, yes, in the very beginning, if I'm a leader or a manager or supervisor, and I'm starting up with my team, I probably need to spend like an hour plus or minus with each team member creating that individual performance map. But once I have that, and where we get real clear on what your job is and what the expectations are and who your customers are and all that, whether you're new to the job or you've been in it for a while, once we're real clear on that, then it's not that big a deal to say, well, what's the most important thing we could work on this week? And one of the things you need to do is implement that. You need to have an organization that says, we need a cadence of at least like every other week check-ins or whatever. And some companies already do that with their because coaching, as you probably know, has become a big deal in a lot of companies. There's a
Yeah.
lot of money put into coaching, but our view is that accomplishment-based coaching, I mean, you can do other stuff too, but it's really focused on that thing of enabling your people to do well and find out what's working for them, and enabling them to produce outputs. So after a little bit of time, that can become like a quick check-in at the water cooler if it's not virtual, or a quick Zoom meeting where you say, how's the proposal stuff going on? How are you doing with the needs part of the proposal? Let's take a look at that. You know what? You could do this and that and that. Why don't you try that and go look at one that John produced because it's really good. It may be that simple in some cases. So, but what we're trying to do is develop a relationship and, frankly, a culture among managers and leaders where the whole idea is we're trying to help people be more productive and happy about it, and like, wow, I'm getting better. So one of the best bits I ever had years ago when we used to have a management version of our program that had development plans. And we went to one of our largest performance consulting clients and said, hey, you want to do this? And they said, we don't want any more paperwork. We just want conversations that produce action steps between managers and their people. So I said, okay. So we created a coaching program that really doesn't require much paperwork at all if you don't want to. But I was delivering a program. It was actually early on in one company. And we had some directors and some managers in the group. And when we were talking about it, one of the directors, wise fellow, and it was a high tech company, he said, I tell the guys that work for me, or the people who work for me, that they should spend about 10% of their time developing their people, because that's a really important part of their job. And he said, what I tell them is if it's taking more than that, or if they can't find time to do that, come to me and we'll readjust their priorities. We'll readjust what we expect from them. Now, you can't magically create more time. But I think if you have an organization where people say, no, this is a priority, we want to improve the performance of our people, and they set clear expectation about how much time should be devoted to that, then it should be possible from an organizational level to help arrange conditions for that. Yeah. So it's not just to teach people to do it and have them go do it. You got to implement it, because otherwise, the other point about it is we have implemented it in companies where people were all hot to trot with it, but then they didn't make time. And so the only time they pull it out is when their employee is having a problem. And that's too late. The horse is out of the barn, then you're being a problem solver rather than a helper, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And you redefined coaching early when you were doing your presentation, saying versus, if you look it up, is it sports coaching, or is it this, where you ask questions and such? Right. You've done it. It's almost like a mentor coach. It's more of a, the actual task.
On that point, I don't want to blather on too much, but I've always been puzzled by why in business coaching looks the way it often does, which is kind of like non-directive therapy. In sports, you say, we need you to get the ball between the uprights, and I'm going to show you how and give you feedback about how you're doing. This is what coaching has always meant to me, but in business, it often doesn't look that way.
Yeah. And then you're just like, okay. And if you're just spending time and just think, okay, what are you going to do? And what are you going to do? It does it. People leave. Yeah. So anyway, thank you. Those are my questions. And this is
great questions.
Great. Appreciate
Thank you.
The time.
And like you said, Dr. Binder, you said, people have probably higher job satisfaction when they feel like they're accomplishing things, so it probably ties into retention and satisfaction ratings and everything
Absolutely.
else.
Well, there's a whole nother thing that we've got that's about the 6 boxes and the Gallup 12 and how you could use that to optimize engagement. But that when you do exit interviews of people leaving, a lot of the complaints are, I didn't have opportunities to develop. And this will address that. I think Al might have a question, though, or are you just showing your face?
Al has his hand raised, and Mike Zosel also
First
put
edition.
a question in the chat.
All right, very good.
Al says, "What a great accomplishment for you today."
Dick Malot's? Is that Dick Malot's thing? The third one you showed? You're on mute though, Al. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
It's authored
Yeah.
by a guy named Breathauer, but it was
Oh yeah. I know Dale. He was an old friend of mine. Yeah, absolutely.
So anyhow, the reason I showed those is as you were talking about it, I was kind of remembering experiences in my career that made an impact. And when I was a baby instructional designer at 3M, they brought in Joe Harless to sort of teach us the way it ought to be done. And so he's one of the ones that said, an ounce of analysis is worth a pound of instruction. And
yeah,
objectives.
Okay, all right. Anyhow, then he went on and taught us how to, set up antecedents for behaviors and consequences as we developed our training. But one of the things while you were speaking, I went and got this book off the shelf. And the first 75 pages of his book, he talks about performance improvement potential, trying to be mathematical in the PIP.
Yeah.
So did that ever go anywhere? Has that ever raised its surface again?
That's a really good question, Al. So first of all, what was interesting about Tom is a lot of his examples were like yellow pages, salespeople, or whatever, where you had very explicit measures that you could very clearly define the exemplary behavior and the average. A lot of, as you well know, a lot of jobs are not measured like that. So that was always a little bit of a challenge, which was how do you identify the exemplary performers? Now, first of all, there's a guy named Paul Elliott and his colleague Al Folsom, who wrote a book called Exemplary Performance, and they took Tom's idea and they developed it quite a bit. And they actually, I think the book second edition came out recently. We teach it in a very simple way. I don't call it a PIP anymore, because in many companies, PIP is performance improvement plan, which is the thing you do before you kick the guy out. So we call it the upside potential. And the notion being, what's the gap between average performance and best performance? The way we apply it is a little bit more, maybe less numerical in some cases. But we say, have you got any people, talk to a manager, let's say, or director of a department or whatever, who are really good, who are extraordinary, who always get it done in time, or sometimes it's not the whole job either. Because you know very well, sometimes people are super good at proposals, but they couldn't close a deal if their life depended on it. So you look for people who might be good at some of the accomplishments. I have not been as quantitative as Tom would suggest we could be, but I've tried to identify best, people who are really super good, interviewed them and maybe observed them, and also average performers. And guaranteed when you get into behavior, you'll see they do little tricks. You'll say, wait a minute, what did you just do there? And they say, oh, I don't know. And then, because they don't even know sometimes. So I've had, in very practical terms, I could give you a bunch of examples, but simple things where like a simple example, at Intel, this factory maintenance guys, there were these giant machines that make chips that would break down between their monthly maintenances, and they'd measure mean time between failure. And there were a few people who it never happened, that nothing leaked, it all worked, and next time it was ready, they just did the maintenance and it was fine. So we observed some of those guys, and one of my favorite examples was, one of the things that often happened was fluid would leak from these things. So this guy was doing maintenance and he was finishing up, and he reached underneath the machine to a place he couldn't see, and he lingered in there. And we said, wait a minute, what are you doing there? He said, well, here, come on over here. Put your finger up here. There was a little place where you had to pop a little rubber plug. And he said, look, if that thing is not seated properly, it's going to be leaking in a few days. So I run my fingers around there to be sure it's seated properly. He never told anybody that. It was never in the maintenance book. So the answer is, I try really hard in a sort of I always say, throw a little exemplary performer analysis into any project you can. And then sometimes I've gotten requests, like in sales, to do a best practices study, which is as close to that as you can get. I think if you want to really drill into it, see what Elliott and Folsom say in their book, which I haven't read it for a while. It's gone somewhere, but not quite where Tom took it exactly, I think. Great question, though, man. I love it when people have this background and know about this stuff.
I hate to be outdone by Al. I just want to show you my first edition here. You can see it. Oh, is it backwards?
Oops.
There you
Taxonomy.
go. No.
Oh, there it is, upside down.
No, it's upside down.
That's upside down.
Is that? Okay. It's my.
So even who is that from? Who wrote that? Who's that? Is that Nager? Who is that?
That's Bloom.
Oh, of course. Oh, of course it is. Yeah. Of
That's
course
the
it is.
original
Yeah.
taxonomy of organizational objectives, 1954.
Well, I have signed copies of Skinner's books, so man,
Well,
the
I
funny,
know we're almost out of time here.
yeah.
Mike did
Yeah,
have a
now we got more
question in
books
the
coming up.
chat.
There you go.
So I don't
This
know,
is the
Mike,
old timers hour.
do you want me to read it for you, Mike? It's he had posted in the chat, with our increasingly fast-paced work world, are you seeing a growth in interest in accomplishment-based talent development in businesses today?
Good question. I don't think people know about it, which is one of the reasons that I published that thing in TD Magazine. I'm trying to legitimize this.
Yeah.
Because Joe Harless's ABCD was lovely for the few of us who even knew anything about it, and some of the big companies that adopted it. But I don't even think most of our performance improvement colleagues are entirely accomplishment based. I'm sure they're not. And so for me, there's a big effort to change. And so what I'm seeing is that early adopters and innovators, who are usually the people that I work with, because I'm usually doing new stuff that nobody ever thought of, like fluency based instruction and stuff. I would love to see it happen. I would love to, but again, that's why I put something in TD Magazine.
Yeah.
ATD is not my favorite organization, but they get to a lot of folks, right? So
yeah,
let's get it in there.
Right.
And I'm going to give a talk on this, I think, at their org development thing next fall.
Okay.
But it's a great question. The answer is, I wish. If you can help, let's work on it,
Yeah, right.
What's wonderful about it is that it really breaks things down and helps people slow everything down, because it's going 100 miles an hour, with, all the new advents in our businesses today. And you walking in there, or any trained professional that is comfortable with this wonderful model, that can go in and really start to help them slow things down and really start zeroing in. And I so do agree about the outputs. If you understand the outputs, you can always work backwards from there and understand it in a unique way.
Yeah.
So again, thank you so much for coming to visit with us. And it's always such a joy to have you here, because you're always, it's just like you just go and you're always cranking away, and you really believe in the model.
Well, you guys are the most fun group I ever speak to, I have to say, because I have people who can put up the books and know their stuff,
Yeah, exactly.
But one thing about that, Michael, you said slowing people down, but they also discover it's easier. If they will slow down, they say, oh, this is actually a lot less fuzzy than the stuff we've been doing.
Right.
So they actually can move more quickly in the end, I believe.
Yeah.
Carl, one of the reactions I get to that question is, that you tell them and they go, that's good. That's exactly how I think. And you say, well, then why don't you do it?
Right.
And that would be like work.
Well, of course, we call our thing, actually got named by clients, performance thinking, because those models, like when you look at the HPT model, it's beautiful, but you can't think with that all at once. You have to kind of look around in it. But the performance chain and the 6 boxes model, there's 21 plain English words in there. And what we find is that when people start looking at the world, whatever their jobs are, through that kind of filter
lens,
they can informally do stuff. They can do a lot of ad hoc, like most of the people that we develop as performance consultants say they maybe spend 20 or 30% of their time on big projects, but a lot of times they are doing ad hoc things. They'll be in a meeting where somebody's arguing that, well, we put our HR business partners out in the field now, we still got somebody in central office and they're stepping on each other's toes. And they say, well, has anybody defined their outputs? Maybe that's it. Maybe we have to have a clear definition of their jobs. So it's just a little piece of this that becomes useful. Or people say, well, is that because the expectations are unclear? Oh, never thought of that. So you can think through problems in an informal way with this approach also. Anyway, I'm blathering at this point.
No, but speaking of the 6 boxes, I've used that. I think I used it at Honeywell when they came to me with a solution, and I said, let's just take a look here and think this through. And I pulled up the 6 boxes model and showed them it, and they're like, you're right, it's actually a different problem. We wouldn't have solved it with that solution, to just throw up training at it or whatever, when it's this issue instead. And so, taking the time for some analysis up front makes a huge difference.
Well, the other thing is, Al, you put up the Dale Breathauer thing, and Dale is a friend of mine, and I know about behavioral systems, but his work was way complicated. You had very complex pictures of behavior systems. And what I think is true of the behavior engineering model and now the way we use the 6 boxes is it actually does have all the variables in it that affect performance in one simple little framework. And so I think it allows you to kind of cut to the chase pretty fast on problems. And I don't want to make that big of a deal of it, but at the 22 ISPI conference, Scott Worthing had a session that I didn't know he was going to do called "What's the best performance model in the world?" And they voted the 6 boxes. I thought, oh,
yay!
That's pretty cool. Anyway,
that's great. Well, I know we're over our time by a few minutes here. Are there any other questions or comments from anyone?
So I just have one question. So when you were with Skinner, did you start with rats, with pigeons, or with humans?
He didn't. I met Fred very late. I was a college student, didn't know anything about behavior science. Somebody assigned Walden 2 his novel. I read it and was offended, like most people in the 60s might have been. I had a professor whose wife was getting a behavior therapy PhD, and she said something to me, and I reread it and got all excited. I wrote him a fan letter, and he wrote me back 2 weeks later a lovely letter and said, stay in touch if you're still interested in this. I then visited Harvard a year later, walked in on him after conversation. He said, you should apply here. Now, he didn't have a lab anymore. So I spent 2 years while I was doing my coursework, doing independent study. I'd read his books and meet with him every week about stuff or help him edit about behaviorism. And then he sent me to a woman, B. Barrett, who had a human operant conditioning lab. And so I did laboratory research there with people who were then clinically called mentally retarded in an institution. But very quickly, I got into instructional applications with his measure, rate of response, but in a teaching setting. And then one of my mentors, Ogden Lindsley, who was the creator of this precision teaching thing, he told me after about 8 or 10 years, he said, I want you to go into business. And I didn't know anything about business, but I did. And I started by applying fluency-based stuff to sales and then customer service. And then Tom Gilbert blew my mind and expanded my perspective. So I didn't ever really work much with rats or pigeons. I work with people in the lab.
So my original advisor was Kenneth McCorkadale at University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
And Wells Hively was big in precise personal, whatever. And then there were a bunch of other people who worked with applied behavior analysis first at one of the local institutions, and one of the key people, Travis Thompson, went on to work with autistic kids. So it's a hotbed of behaviorism in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Well, I have all these friends because I started out in behavior analysis, and I still go to the behavior analysis conferences and such. I don't really, to me, I'm more interested. ISPI became a much more compelling organization to me when all the thought leaders were still alive. Now I'm an old guy, and we're the old ones. But I still have a huge network of friends in that world, and I think that's one of the reasons why, as the autism business has gotten to be an industry, some of them are showing up and wanting performance improvement, process improvement, stuff like that. But I know all those people. I just talked with Charles Catania. I don't know if his name is familiar to you.
I've heard
he's one of the few Skinner doctoral students who's still alive, and he's still kicking. He's 88. I talked to him for the first time in like 30 years yesterday, and he's still publishing, and it's amazing.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah. Anyway, our time probably is up, but I appreciate you guys. Yeah, thank you all.
Well, and I will share this recording with you, Carl, and I'll also share it with everyone on the email list. So, and I'll send out the TD article as well
Cool.
again.
One thing I should mention, I don't know if you noticed it, but I got a message, I think at the hour, I'm not sure, that said your time limit for a free account for recording is now up. So I don't know if it will have recorded the whole session or not, but we'll find out.
I'll check it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I did see that too, and I've never seen that before. So I don't know. Maybe they're putting a limit on the time now or something. I'm not sure.
Who knows?
So-
Anyway, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you
Thanks.
soon at the conference.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. It's a real
All right.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.